I came across this poll recently and I find it so goddamn amusing. Even Republicans think the amount of anti-LGBTQ plus legislation is excessive political theater. Blue is for this is too much legislation, politicians are playing political theater and using these bills as a wedge issue. Gray is for I don't know. Red is for this is the right amount of legislation. Politicians are dealing with a real danger that needs to be addressed. Among Democrats, 72% say this is too much legislation, 9% say they are not sure, and a startling 20% say yes, this is the right amount of legislation. This is a legitimate issue. Among independent and third-party voters, 65% say this is too much legislation, 14% are unsure, and 21% say this is the right amount of legislation. And perhaps the most surprising, 55% of Republicans say this is too much legislation, 11% are on the fence, and 33% say this is the right amount of legislation. In total, 64% of all likely voters think this is too much legislation, 11% are unsure, and 25% agree with all this legislation that is going around against trans people currently. This says a lot about the Republican voter base. They are not a monolith. Not every single person who votes for the GOP is down with all this rampant anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric that has been going around among the GOP for the past year or so at this point. Every time I think about how this rhetoric isn't resonating with the common voter, I think back to the midterms this past November, because pretty much the entire platform of the Republican Party last year was just, we gotta do something about these trans people. I mean, they only make up like 1% of the fucking population, but we still gotta do something about them regardless because they're this huge problem in our society. And then look at the results in midterms. It was projected to be a blowout in favor of the Republicans. Instead, it was just a hollow victory. They just barely won the House. And there has been zero introspection among the GOP. Instead of shifting their focus to something else, they instead quadruple down on this anti-trans bullshit. And you know what? Let it bite them in the ass in 2024. Because this anti-trans panic is not the home run issue they like to make it seem. Because let's stop and think for a second. How many voters in this country are actually negatively affected by trans people just existing? I forget which state this exactly was, but I remember some governor in some state really going hard against trans women competing in women's sports in school, and then it was found out like only 1 or 2 trans women were competing in women's sports in school in that state. This whole trans panic is a non-issue, and even most voters seem to think the same. They want to see policy enacted that actually benefits them, because they likely have never even fucking met a trans person. But the GOP has nothing to offer besides tapping into the bigotry of so many people in this country. This just goes to show that social media is not representative of real life. You see all of these anti-trans Twitter accounts, such as Libs of TikTok, get so much traction, but you have to remember that social media usually puts a spotlight on the fringe of society. Your average voter is likely not as plugged in as you or I, or doesn't pay attention to the online political sphere nearly as much as someone like me. It's easy to go full doomer when you look at the vile shit that people are spewing online, but polls such as this are a nice reminder that much of society is not down with this rampant anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric that has been going around. Most of society are not watching people like Matt Walsh. They can't give a shit less what other people want to do with their own bodies, so long as they are harming no one else. I just wish that all of these GOP voters who are dissatisfied with all the anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric and legislation going around among the Republican Party would put their money where their mouth is and stop voting for these politicians. So this is a little snippet of good news, I suppose, but let's see how all this anti-trans rhetoric carries the GOP in 2024. A lot can happen between now and then. But for now, take solace in the fact that most of society seems to not be for all this anti-LGBT rhetoric and legislation. It turns out when you focus solely on issues that have fuck all to do with most voters in this country are not inclined to side with you. Wow. That's all I have to say. Bye-bye.